The morning the great blizzard broke, Ada Rennick walked out to the north line of her home pasture and found the whole basin gone white and still and dead, and her cattle alive. She was 24 years old that winter, and she had not slept. The snow had stopped in the black hours before dawn, the wind fallen off all at once, and the silence that came after was the loudest thing she had ever stood inside. She pulled on her late mother's charcoal wool coat and went out with a lantern she did not need, because the sky in the east had gone the color of skimmed milk, and there was light enough to see the end of the world by. Past the corner post where her ground met the open range, the drifts lay in long-combed waves, and against the bare barbed wire fences the neighbors had strung there were dark shapes half buried, hundreds of them, that had been living beasts 2 days before. The cattle had drifted before the storm as cattle do, tails to the wind, walking until the wire stopped them, and there they had piled and frozen on their feet. She did not look long. She turned instead to the thing along her north fence, a wall of dark green a full head taller than she was, dense as a thundercloud brought down to earth, and behind it, in the still trough of quiet air the wall had made, her herd stood chewing. Snow lay heaped on the windward face in a smooth white bank. On her side the ground was only dusted. Her cows breathed steam into the cold and watched her come with the mild faces of animals that had never once been afraid. 2 seasons the basin had laughed at that hedge. They had a name for her by the second summer, and it was not a kind one. She stood in the killing calm of that morning, a young woman in a dead woman's coat, and there was no gloating in her, because there was no one yet awake to gloat to, and because gloating was never the point. To understand how a hedge came to stand between Ada Rennick's cattle and their graves, you have to go back a year and a half, to the spring she spent nearly her last dollar on a wagon load of what every reasonable man in the county considered garbage. If you have ever done a patient, unglamorous thing that the people around you decided was proof you had lost your senses, then you already know the shape of this story. Stay with her. She had come to the basin the year before with her mother dying in the wagon bed and a homestead claim in a tin box under the seat. Her mother, Marion, had grown up on the Kansas prairie in the years just after the war, on ground where a person could see clear to the curve of the earth, not one tree, not one stone to break a wind that came down out of the north, with nothing to slow it for 1,000 miles. Marion kept a book, bound in brown leather, gone soft at the corners, filled front to back, in a small slanting hand. And Ada had grown up watching her write in it by lamplight, and never once thought to ask what it was for. Marion died that first autumn, before the frost, and was buried on a rise above the creek. Ada was left with 40 acres of deeded ground, a sod house with 1 glass window, 11 head of thin cattle, and the book. She did not read it straight through. Grief does not read straight through. She opened it here and there in the evenings, touching it like a hand she missed, and mostly what she found was weather and seed and the price of things. But near the middle the hand grew careful, almost formal, as if Marion had been copying something she meant to keep, and those pages were about a hedge. There was a plant her mother had written, that the old Kansas homesteaders set in place of fences before wire came cheap. It had come up out of Texas and the Indian country, a thorny, crooked, ill-tempered tree the French trappers called bois d'arc, bow wood, because the tribes made their bows of it, and that Americans called Osage orange, or simply hedge, or, for the great knobbled green fruit it dropped, hedge apple. Set the seedlings a hand apart, her mother wrote. Plash them low the first years so they threw their branches sideways, and inside 4 seasons you would have a living wall so dense a rabbit could not push through, so armed no steer would lean on it. Horse high, she had copied out. Bull strong, hog tight. That was as far as most people ever read the argument for a hedge, and it was reason enough. But it was not the reason Marian had underlined. Ada found the underlining on a later page and did not yet understand why her mother had pressed the pencil hard enough to nearly cut the paper. She closed the book and the next week went out and spent her money. There was a nurseryman down at the rail town of Coulter's Ford with a stock of hedge seedlings nobody wanted, bare root whips no thicker than a bootlace, 1,000 of them heeled into a trench, going yellow for want of a buyer. Everyone was stringing wire now. A man could fence a section in a week and be done. Nobody had the patience for a fence that would not be a fence for 4 years. Ada bought the whole trench for $11 and drove them home under wet sacking. The nurseryman shook his head the whole time he loaded. "You're a young woman burying good money in the ground," he said, not unkindly. "Wire's cheaper, and wire's a fence tomorrow. This here won't turn a calf for years. Then it'll be a better fence than yours," she said. "It'll just take longer to get." She planted them along the north fence first, because her mother's book was plain the north side was the one that mattered, though it did not, on those pages, say why. She sat near a mile of them, a hand apart in a shallow furrow, on her knees in the cold spring mud, from first light to last, for 11 straight days. And when she finished, her hands would not fully open, and there stood. All along that boundary, a green thread of life no higher than a knife. The basin came to look. They rode out of their path to sit their horses at her corner and consider the little green thread, and then consider her. Foremost among them was a rancher named Harmon Vell, who ran the biggest wired outfit on that side of the basin and had quietly wanted her 40 acres since the day her mother was buried, because her creek watered better than his. Vell was a heavy, mild man who never raised his voice. "I've seen a great many fool notions in my time," he said pleasantly, looking down at the seedlings. "Never one a person got down on her knees for. It'll be a fence, Mr. Vell, give it time. It'll be a weed patch. And weeds don't hold cattle." He touched his hat because he was always courteous and rode home. By the next Saturday, the whole basin had it that the Rennick girl was farming a fence, watering it like corn, and the name they gave her that summer was the Hedge girl. And they said it as men say a thing they have decided is safe to laugh at. One man did not laugh. His name was Wesley Kellen, a lean, quiet cowhand of about 26, who worked cattle for wages up and down that side of the basin and owned nothing but a good saddle, a string of borrowed horses, and 40 head of his own he ran on other men's grass while he tried to put together a start. He came by that first spring looking for work and found her on her knees with 1,000 seedlings. "What are they?" he asked. He did not laugh. He got down off his horse and crouched at the row. "Hedge, Osage orange, they'll grow into a fence you can't kill." She braced for the smile she had learned to expect. "My grandfather set a hedge in Illinois, before the wire. Nothing on God's earth got through it." He took off his coat and knelt in the mud beside her and set seedlings until dark, and took no pay and came back and did it again. He hauled water for her rows all that dry first summer in a barrel on a stone boat up from the creek evening after evening, and built a low woven fence of brush to turn stock off the seedlings while they were small. When the basin took to laughing at the Hedge girl, It laughed as well at the hired man who watered her weeds. "They're saying things about the two of us," she told him one evening at the creek, ashamed on his account. "You could stop coming. I wouldn't hold it against you." He looked at the water a while. "Let 'em talk. Talk's cheap. Cheaper than wire even, and that was the whole of it," and she laughed for what felt like the first time since her mother died. And he came around more after, not less. That is the thing the basin never understood about those two. They were not two lonely people clinging together out of want. They were the only two in that country who had looked at the same patient, laughable work and seen the sense in it. A rarer thing to find than a fair face, and neither said so for a long while. The hedge grew, slowly, as it does. It went from a thread to a knee-high tangle, and Ada plashed it as the book said, half cutting the young stems and bending them down, so the whole row knit sideways into one thing instead of a line of separate little trees. By the end of the second summer, her hands were a map of white thorn scars, and the north line had thickened to a hedge waist, high and wicked, with inch-long spines, and had begun to seem less a crop than a wall. Then came the summer that nearly ended it. It came in dry. The spring rains failed and did not return, and by July the basin grass went from green to gray, the creek shrank to a chain of warm pools, and the sun stood up white and merciless. The wired outfits suffered too. But wire does not care whether it rains. A young hedge cares very much. Ada's hedge began to die. It died from the top down and the ends in. Whole stretches she had bled for going from green to bare gray sticks rattling in the hot wind. She carried water in the barrel until her shoulders gave out, then in buckets, two at a time, from a creek that was itself dying. Still, it burned. By August, a third of it stood dead. That was the season Harmonvale stopped smiling and started being kind, which was worse. He rode out in the white heat of an afternoon, looked at her dead sticks with an expression of real and terrible sympathy, and made her an offer for the 40 acres that was, he was careful to say, more than the ground was worth. "Take the money and go back east to your people," he said gently, as a friend. "Don't spend your whole young life on your knees over a thing that plainly will not work." "It's my mother's ground," she said, "and her hedge. Your mother's dead, child, and so is the hedge. Look at it." And she looked at it, and the awful part, the part she told no one but Wesley, was that for the space of one long breath she wanted to say yes. The pressure did not come to her alone. It came to Wesley, too, and harder, because a hired man must work for the men of a basin, and those men had begun to make it plain that a cowhand who watered a fool woman's dead weeds was one they would think twice about. At a branding that August, Vel took him aside. "You're a good hand throwing yourself away on a lost cause and a lost woman both," Vel told him. "There's steady work on my outfit for a sensible man who knows when a thing is finished. Obliged, but I don't believe it is finished. It's dead sticks, son. Hedge comes back from the root," Wesley said. "You'll see." Wesley came to her that evening. She was standing in the dead row with a grubbing hoe, 3 plants already cut out. And she meant that night to cut the rest and string wire like a sane person and be done. "Vel offered me steady work," he said. "To quit you. You should take it." She did not look up. "There's nothing here. I was wrong, and my mother was wrong, and there's a mile of dead sticks to prove it." She set the hoe to the roots of the 4th plant. "Some of it's dead, not all." He crouched at the base of a gray, bare stem she was about to grub out, cut a thin curl of bark from it low near the ground, and held it up. Under the dead gray outside, the sliver of inner bark was green, wet, live, stubborn green. It's holding on down low where the ground's got a little water yet. Cut it off at your knee and let it be. It'll come again from the root. Hedge always comes from the root. That's the whole devil of it. You can't kill the thing even when you want to. He looked up at her. No persuasion in his face, only that plain steadiness. You've come this far on your knees. Don't stand up now, because Harmon Vell's afraid of your creek. She did not grub out the row. She cut it back hard, to the living green low down, as he said, and wept doing it. Wesley turned down the steady work and lost. That winter, most of the paying jobs he had counted on, and the two of them went into the fall poorer and more laughed at than ever, with a mile of hedge cut to shin high stubs and no earthly proof it would ever be worth a thing. The rains returned in September after they had done their damage. Out of those cut stubs, out of the stubborn living root, the hedge came again exactly as he had promised, thicker for the cutting, throwing up 2 and 3 new stems where there had been one, so that by the time the cold came, that autumn the north line stood green again and waist high and closing fast, healthier than ever. Nobody in the basin noticed. It was busy with its own good fortune, a fine fall, the grass back with the rain, the price of beef up in the eastern markets. Harmon Vell had gone deep into debt to buy 400 more head to run behind his shining new wire, because the range looked, that November, like money lying on the ground for anyone with the wire to fence it. Ada Rennick did not go into debt. She had $11 of hedge and 11 head of cattle and a mother's book she had now read to the last page, and she had understood at last what her mother pressed the pencil hard enough to cut the paper to write. It had made her afraid in a way the laughing basin was not, because the basin had never read it. The winter came early and wrong. The old hands felt it before the almanacs did. The muskrats built their houses high and thick along the creek. The horses grew coats like bears. The geese had gone south 3 weeks early in long, unhurried lines and not calling. And in the 3rd week of a bitter January, the sky in the northwest went the color of a fresh bruise and stayed so for a day and a half. A low green-black wall along the whole northern rim of the world, and the air turned dead and still, and every animal on that range went quiet at once. Ada knew what it was. Her mother's book knew what it was. She brought her 11 head up off the open ground into the lee of the north hedge, where the wall of thorn stood between her cattle and that bruise-colored sky, and forked down what hay she had. As she led them in, she saw Wesley driving his own 40 head up her lane behind her, because he had read the sky too, and trusted no other shelter. "Room for mine behind that hedge of yours?" he called over the rising wind. "There's room. Get them in behind the green and keep them close to it. Don't let them drift." "I've got no intention of letting them drift," he called back. "That's the whole idea, isn't it? They got the last of the stock behind the hedge as the first snow came, and it did not come as flakes. It came as a wall, a moving smoke of fine, hard snow driven flat and level on a wind that arrived all at once out of the northwest with the sound of a train that never passed, and took the breath from your mouth and the heat from your bones and the whole visible world down to an arm's length of white. It was the wind that killed, not the cold, not the snow. The wind, 3 days of it without 1 hour's pause, driving every unsheltered animal in the territory before it to die. For 3 days and nights the great storm stood on the basin and screamed. Out on the open range, along all those glittering miles of new barbed wire, the cattle did the only thing cattle know in such a wind. They turned their tails to it and walked. They drifted, mile on mile, blind and freezing, walking from the wind because walking was the last warmth they had until they fetched up against a fence. And the wire held them. The wire that had gone up in a week held them in the open with their tails to the killing wind, and they piled against it and against each other, and the snow drifted over them, and they died standing. And here is what her mother had underlined, pressed so hard into the page it nearly tore. A wall of wire stops a cow and lets the wind through. A wall of living hedge stops the wind itself. On the south side of the north line, in the still trough of dead air the hedge threw for 30 feet behind itself, there was no wind. The storm went over the top of the wall and came down again well out in the pasture and left right against the hedge, a long sheltered pocket of quiet, cold, brutally cold, but still. The snow that would have buried the cattle piled instead on the windward face, caught and held by the thorns, building into a great smooth ramp of white that became one more layer of shelter. The cattle bedded down in the lee, hers and Wesley's together, 50 odd head in the one pocket of stillness in a screaming world, and they lived. All 3 days she and Wesley went out on a rope tied to the door, hand over hand, forking hay to the sheltered stock and breaking the ice on the water, unable to see their own hands past the wrist. Every time the rope brought her up against that wall of green in the dark, she put her scarred hand on it and felt the storm breaking against the far side and no wind at all on hers. On the 4th morning, the wind fell off all at once, like a fever breaking, and the silence came down, and Ada Rennick walked out to the north line and found the basin dead and her cattle alive. Harmon Vell lost every head he owned. He had run near 700 that winter, most bought on debt, and when the storm lifted his men, found them drifted and frozen against the fences 3 and 4 deep for miles, 400 alone piled dead along the stretch of wire nearest the open north, the wire that had faced the same weather her hedge faced and held nothing back. Half the outfits in the basin were broken that week. The territory called it the Great Die-Up After, and men who lived through it would go quiet when it came up in talk. She did not gloat. There was no scene that spring in which Ada Rennick stood at the mercantile and told Harmon Vell and the rest what they could do with their wire. She was not that kind of woman, and anyway the basin did its own reckoning without help from her. They came to the hedge instead. That was the reckoning. All that raw spring, the men of the basin rode out 1 and 2 at a time to her north line and sat their horses where they had once sat to laugh, and looked at the long green living wall standing untouched, and at the 50-odd fat living head bedded in its lee, and took off their hats. Harmon Vell came last, in April, ruined, on a borrowed horse, his own good animals dead with the rest. He sat a long while at the corner post and said nothing. Ada came out and stood on her side of the hedge and waited, and did not make it easy for him. "How?" he said at last. It was not quite a question. How did the cussed thing do it? It's only a hedge. So she told him. She did not send him off, and she did not crow. Standing in the mud she had knelt in through 2 long summers, she gave him what her mother had underlined. The wire stopped your cattle and let the wind through to kill them. The wall stopped the wind. The drift piled up harmless on the north face instead of burying the stock. That's all it is. Any man here can grow the same wall along his own north line for the price of some seedlings and 4 years of patience. He looked at the green head of it above him and said nothing. "I'll give you seed from my own hedge apples in the fall, if you want them," she said, "and show you how to set them. I mean it." Vell looked at her a long time. He was a proud man and a beaten one, and it cost him something to get the words out. I called you the Hedge girl. The whole basin did. I'm sorry for it. You were the only one of us that read the weather right. He put his hat back on and rode his borrowed horse home. That fall he came for the seed, hat in hand, and set his own hedge, and so did half the basin. It spread from there, as a true thing spreads once it has been proved at a price no one can argue with. Within a few years, living windbreaks ran the north lines the whole length of that basin, and the county wrote the practice into its books, and the agricultural men from the territorial college came and studied her original north line and set it down in a careful account. Somewhere in that account, at her plain insistence, they recorded the name of a woman called Marion, who had carried the knowledge west from the Kansas prairie and pressed it so hard into a leather book that it outlived her and saved a basin full of cattle and the men who owned them. The book itself was read aloud, one page of it, at the Grange the winter after the die-up, the underlined page. The one about the wind. There was not a sound in the hall while it was read, and Ada sat in the back and let her mother's copied words do the only speaking she had ever wanted done. She and Wesley Kellen married that summer. It was not a rescue, and neither one would ever have called it one. He had knelt in her mud when it was only mud. She had kept him fed and sane through the winter the basin turned its back on him. They had found the same patient work from two directions and been laughed at together. And when it was over and quiet again, there was no one else in the world either could imagine standing beside. They ran their two herds as one after that, behind the one green wall, and there is a photograph of them in a county history, standing at the corner of that hedge in their good clothes, not touching, a careful foot of air between them, both wearing the same faint, private smile. The smile of two people who were right about a thing when no one else could see it. There is one of these stories in more counties than you would think. Somewhere a person is on their knees right now in a row of something the neighbors have already decided is a fool's errand, watering it, waiting on it, being laughed at for it, reading a patient truth out of the hand of someone who loved them and is gone. Most you never hear, because the weather that would prove them right has not come yet. This one you heard because the wind came and stopped at a wall of thorn. If this one stayed with you, tell me down in the comments about a time you were sure of something the whole room had already laughed off, the slow, unglamorous, patient thing you knew was right when no one around you could see it. Did the wind ever come to prove you out, or are you still on your knees in the row, waiting? If you have made it this far into a story about the people the world writes off too soon, then you already know why this channel exists, so stay a while. And if you would like another story about someone the world underestimated and lived to be sorry for, there is one waiting for you right here.